And Victor has been running a business with his co-founder, Kieran, that has done many different things, including tokenizing assets on-chain, obviously in the Ethereum ecosystem, being the initial company that was the realization of the concept of blockchain as a service. And this was launched on Microsoft's cloud, along with the team as a partner, essentially. So this goes way back, like 2016 probably. Victor can give you the details on that. And also has tokenized silver, and has a marketplace that they built on top of this network that they're running as well. So I'd like to welcome up Victor, and we're going to share a microphone, Victor, just so you're aware. So come on over this way.
Okay. We'll share the same space.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe Victor, you could do an introduction in your words first.
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me today. I am founder and chief product officer at Block Apps. That's my day job. Block Apps' mission is to drive adoption of the next 1 billion blockchain users by offering them rare and valuable things. We are doing this by basically focusing on real-world asset tokenization. I'll use some more technical terminology. And doing this on our own Ethereum-derived private blockchain called STRATO Mercata. We'll talk a bit more about the specific things that we're tokenizing in a minute. But in addition to my role at Block Apps, I helped launch the public Ethereum blockchain. I was a co-creator of Blockchain as a Service with our partners here at Microsoft, and I'm one of the founding board members of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. Thank you for having me.
Amazing, Victor. So there's a lot to unpack there, obviously. Victor uses one of my favorite phrases, which is "in my day job," because apparently we'll all have lots of other jobs as well in the things that we do. So yes, Victor is a longtime collaborator in the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance as well, one of our well-represented startups in the space with longevity, along with others on the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, such as Consensus, as an example, also a co-founding member. Can you tell us a little bit about, since we're talking specifically about tokenizing assets, maybe start with why you created the Mercata Marketplace, and also what types of assets can be found in the Mercata Marketplace?
Yeah, sure. So, we started off this is a long journey, right? Like, back when I was working on public Ethereum, we always recognized that Ethereum had this ability to really transform, go beyond crypto, and reach out into making an impact on the real world. I think this is something we all share in this room. And our initial way of doing that was to basically launch what became known as private or enterprise blockchain. And we worked with some of the biggest companies in the world, companies like Bayer, we did work with JP Morgan, Microsoft, all of these companies to kind of tokenize, and the term hadn't been created yet, their assets. And this was largely talked about as supply chain kind of use cases, right?
Bayer the pharmaceutical company.
Bayer the pharmaceutical company. But we also work with agricultural companies, we worked with airlines, we worked with a lot of different sectors. And we worked with governments, both on a regional level and all the way up with some of the biggest governments in the world. But what we realized is that two things were kind of evolving in the blockchain world, especially with the way companies were looking at it. One was companies were now getting more and more comfortable with public blockchain infrastructure, which was really exciting to us. And you could see this by the early NFT projects launched by brands like NBA or Nike or Adidas, these kind of product companies that were moving into it. The second thing that was happening is that we saw that the blockchain infrastructure problems were being solved. So a lot of these things that we're talking about scalability, about the technology levels, we worked on many of these problems. This was a huge blocker at the beginning, but it's become less of a blocker now. And so we really wanted to take the next level, which is solve the problem of making someone who is not a degen or a crypto native interested in using blockchain to buy something that is not necessarily blockchain native. And that's broadly what we call real world assets now. And we have already launched this to do things like tokenized silver, for example, also carbon offsets and collectibles. But that is really just the beginning. Our vision is a world where any real world asset can be digitized and freely moved on a blockchain from basically any provider. And I will say a verified real world asset.
So that's a lot of words. Can you specifically describe how are you verifying and controlling the silver offering, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. So let's just talk about the elephant in the room. We've kind of vaguely mentioned it. Fraud is a big problem in the public blockchain world, right? This is kind of, as someone, as someone who was there in the early days, we're kind of baffled at this because we started this because blockchains are meant to provide trust and security. And why have we become synonymous in many people's minds with fraud? And one of the core answers that we have at Block Apps, and this is our view on it, is really, it comes down to identity, right? If you go on to, say, an e-commerce platform or something, you are assured that you are going to get the product that you are delivered because someone has checked that that person saying they're offering it is a real company, right? So, I think there are very strong cases for anonymity, pseudonymity, these kind of things, but in terms of dealing with real world assets, if you want to be reliably trusted that the asset that you're saying you have is real, then you have to provide information about yourself and your company. And so that's, what we are doing with, for example, silver is we are working with a company that vaults and has been in the silver business for 70 years. So we know that they can provide this, and we provide that information to our users. So if, for example, they want to redeem the silver, they know where to go. If they don't get the silver that they're promised, they frankly know who to sue. So we want to provide those protections for our customers.
So many places I could go. So can you talk a little bit about how is that, how are those guarantees happening from a chain perspective, smart contracts, etc. And if you could talk also, maybe link that a little bit to how does that show up in your marketplace and can it show up in other marketplaces? What are the limitations there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, well, really, why we decided to launch our own public blockchain instead of launching this on public Ethereum is that we really realized that we had to work on several different layers, right? And the lowest layer is really on the identity consensus layer. These identity and consensus problems are sort of core to the blockchain itself, and we had to make some modifications in order to suit this use case. It doesn't suit every single use case, but it's really focused on real world assets. So let me just give an example. I talked about identity a bit, but on the consensus layer, we think the problem with real world assets is not simply that transaction costs are too high, right? Think about when you buy things in the real world, right? You don't think about, when I'm buying a house, is $500 too high? That would be a cheap price, right? You think about it in terms of percentage of the value that's being exchanged. So we have kind of moved that type of thinking into our blockchain. We call this colloquially proof of purchase, right? Prices are based on the value being exchanged in the real world. The second layer, and you've talked about, is really modeling the assets themselves. So we work with standard solidity contracts, and we started with the open standards, the 721s, the NFT. So each of the properties that we're talking about on our blockchain are derived mostly from NFT standards that's on the public blockchain. We had to add additional features to that because we had to add features like, coming back to identity, who is the issuer of this original asset? Where is it being housed? All of this information that we had built working with all these huge companies in their supply chain models, we had to put it into our smart contracts. And those are open source and public. You can access them if you want to look at them. And then the last part is really around usability, right? If we want to reach the next wave of blockchain adoption, we can't have the same kind of, you can't have to buy crypto first. You have to be able to buy with a credit card. So we've built an application that is a proof of concept of how users can interact with it. And we call that the Mercata Marketplace.
So that's great. So Victor talked a little bit about so user experience, which, by the way, if you've also been following closely, the Ethereum ecosystem has sort of crossed the chasm on user experience now with what are called, maybe appropriately or not, smart, what is the right terminology? Smart contract wallets?
Smart contract wallets,
Yeah,
yes.
that's a typical technical term. But basically it means you can have a great Web 2 style user experience when onboarding into blockchain as well as when transacting in blockchain. And this fundamentally changes how things were built 3 years ago to how you could build them today and do things like traditional FIDO or Auth0 type of authentications into a wallet, which also gives you a lot of flexibility with how you can do things like rotate keys, use other key signing mechanisms. Some of the hard constraints that we saw with Ethereum accounts that really put a lot of user experience constraints on are now gone. And that's work that obviously the open source development community has been doing and has launched along with some of these other updates in the last year. So very significant sort of the year of UX is also happening alongside the year of scalability and layer 2s and privacy. So another very monumental set of capabilities that we can build on and we need to keep building on. So I want to come back to identity in a second and also harken back to something that Kirti said about JP Morgan, which is there are fundamental constraints around how we do business in the world today. Some of those constraints involve private transactions among trading partners, whether they're buyers and sellers in a supply chain, or whether they're bank-to-bank transactions, or housing market, what have you, right? We never reveal to our competitors who we're buying or sourcing from as a supplier. We never reveal to our suppliers who we're selling to as a buyer, right? And so this is the fundamental nature of global trade, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the session as well. And so privacy is important. What's also been sort of at the forefront of what Victor said, and I use the JP Morgan example here as well, is when we start to realize the ability to have privacy of transactions in a digital first world, you now have a problem of how do I have reputation about who I'm transacting with, right? And that's where the entire world is going, right? The entire world is going towards digital transactions. And so how do you validate the reputation of the people you do business with? If you think about the fact that there's about 330 million suppliers in the world, this is a huge problem, right? Nobody's going to have a single supplier registry, right? And so even, for example, if you look at Microsoft's upstream supply chain, we think there's probably 67 million suppliers in our supply chain. So we're never going to have like a 67 million company registry that we own, where we have to think about this in the context of distributed open source. And that drives you immediately to having to know what's the reputation of an identity that you're transacting with. How do we do this today? We do this through things like DNS, right? If I go to Microsoft.com or if I go to Amazon.com and I do an e-commerce transaction, my expectation is I know who Amazon.com is, right? And that reputation was not obvious in the beginning days of the internet, and it was not obvious in the beginning days of e-commerce. And that's where we are in blockchain, and this is just that exact same sort of transition. And where we have also, in the scenario, and I'll use the JP Morgan Uniswap example, where we want to leverage public infrastructure like the Uniswap contracts to do a trade, we, in a banking world or in a enterprise world, we would have to provide some validity associated with who the parties are that we're transacting with, because there's compliance laws. And in the case of JP Morgan, also have to validate that brokers have to be known users on a particular account that they're transacting on, right? And so JP Morgan did a wonderful example that was published sometime, I forget, maybe 6 months ago. Do you remember? the JP Morgan Uniswap KYC example? Just wondering, okay, yeah. So, time flies. 6 months turned into 2 years. This is such a great example because without making modifications to public infrastructure or public smart contracts, JP Morgan was able to use KYC in front of those transactions so that they could know that their brokers were acting on certain accounts with legitimate other accounts. So really great demonstration of how you bring together compliant workflows and transactions with a public infrastructure like Uniswap. By the way, for those who don't know, Uniswap v4 just launched, and they were waiting for this Denkin update to be able to actually launch v4 because of what it unlocks for their business, and they actually are in an office right around the corner here as well, which is interesting. So coming back to the digital assets that Victor's talking about, and I only use the silver example because it's very easy to think about a bar of silver. If you know anything about like the gold markets or the silver markets, basically it's all in vaults, and people trade in those vaults, and there's physical ownership associated in those vaults where the assets are in those vaults, highly controlled markets. Yeah. In fact, was it 2016, I think CME Group did a gold digitization project that was essentially one of their early blockchain projects, which is a similar idea, leveraging these vault owners who control the assets to actually just digitize it, allow it to be tradable. So how do you, if you think about sort of the world going forward, Victor, some of the choices that we make are always like moment in time choices about technology. Obviously, you've built in the Ethereum ecosystem. Your smart contracts are, therefore portable. Do you think about a world that makes sense for your business that could be a layer 2 type of environment? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, lots of things good there. I just mentioned the one thing that makes me most excited about on-chain wallets and smart contract wallets is if you lose your private key, you don't lose all your stuff. You can, it solves the forgot password problem, which has been a huge problem, right? Wow, there's so many concepts that you tossed out. So how do we think, how do we think about being a layer 2 or working with the whole Ethereum ecosystem? Well, first of all, I think we gotta tip our hat to Karen and Paul for even introducing the idea that there is an Ethereum ecosystem, right? We're not just talking, like everyone when they hear Ethereum is like, okay, that is one blockchain, with one cryptocurrency, and that's not the reality anymore. Like the number of just blockchains that use Ethereum-derived technology, including our own, is massive. Like pretty much, out of the top 20, I think they are either on Ethereum, related to Ethereum, connected in some way, whether they're a layer 2 or a layer 1, they use that core technology in different ways. And if you extend that ecosystem to all the other components, not just technology, but the users of it, the applications that sit on it, the concepts. One thing as sort of inventors of the private Ethereum ecosystem, we realized that there are all these applications that people had never heard about. It's the first time I'm hearing about the great work JPM did, and we worked with JPM like 5 years ago, right? We helped them design some of this stuff in the early days. So it's making that a little bit more visible, and that's something I think that's really exciting about this sort of new direction that EEA is moving in. But I think it's the direction that I think brought us all to the blockchain to begin with. We talk about decentralization, but to use a less formal word, it's really about collaboration. How do we make things that the entire world can use that we benefit from, but everyone else does? This is the promise of open source, this is the promise of a lot of things. And blockchain allows us to do that kind of collaboration. So do we want to continue those collaborations in the future? Absolutely. We've had huge benefits from working with you guys and working with JVM and working with so many parties that have helped guide us. But it's also, I think, the time to really think about how do we bring these things and how do we grow this to go beyond technology? Because we always talk about technology. Now we have to grow this beyond, and we got to think about how do we bring on these other users. I mean, I use this analogy a lot, but like, I think about the people in my life that are not technologists. You know, why would they want to use a blockchain? Now, BlockApp's answer is that you would want to use it to buy things in the real world that you currently don't have access to, because either you can't find them or you can't afford them. So why use blockchain for these things? Well, blockchain is useful because, you know, to use the blockchain terminology, we can fractionalize this. Why does that matter to normal people? It's cheaper. I can buy a piece of commercial real estate without forking over $20 million. I could buy a piece of real estate for $1,000 or $100 or $10, and I can share in the benefits of that piece of that asset, that piece of real estate. Our vision is to be able to do that with every type of illiquid asset, because there are so many types of assets out there that wealthy people can afford and normal people can't. They simply don't have access to them because they're too expensive or they're not visible. Like, if you had the money today to buy Picasso, would you know who to go to? That's, you know, like, but, you know, those benefits need to be democratized to everyone. And we see a world where that can kind of continue.
Okay, I don't think you answered my question at all.
Oh, sorry.
So Kirti talked a little bit about how they're thinking about the future, and, you know, a progressive future, obviously, around how do you go from a private implementation that's maintained, and I don't know if this is the case or not, but maintained by a small number of organizations, to the ultimate place where you want to get, which is, can other people actually develop smart contracts and assets on top of that environment, and or could some of the assets you built be wholesale open source and ported over, right, for other people to use in other environments as well?
Yeah, okay. And I think the answer to this is, the way we think about it is, you know, you always start, it's easier to start by doing everything yourself and taking on those roles, right? Starting as a small network, you know, doing all the development on the projects yourself. But really the long-term benefits are about opening up. And, you know, you can use open source tools for part of that, but the network itself has to open up. So as a concrete example that we saw working with, you know, these large companies, for example, companies went through this progression of how to follow this process from not only a technology standpoint, but a partner and, you know, business standpoint. So everyone, when we launched blockchain as a service, it was a million years ago, but it was 2015 in the blockchain world. You know, everyone we made it possible for every company to spin up their own blockchain on Microsoft Azure. And, you know, people did that. They spun it up, they tried it, and they realized what the real benefit of blockchain is to collaborate with other people, right? So then we went through what I call the consortium phase. All these people businesses started working in these networks where they knew the partners, everyone was very, very clearly delineated who they were working with. And we did these supply chain projects for, you know, energy, supply chain, all of these tracing. But what happened at that consortium, they realized the consortium wasn't large enough. We needed to add data points to make this data more valuable from not only our suppliers, but also people who are doing transport, people who are providing additional value, customers, all of the warehousing. We needed that information. So as that has kind of grown, that's why we decided to launch our own public blockchain, because we were already moving in that direction with the consortiums that we were building. So that's a way to look at it, not just from the technology side.
And I think that's a great point as well. Usually, in the case of JP Morgan, similar to Microsoft, we came up with an idea that was a single solution that had a value case associated with that. We iterated on that over the years, and then we layered on financial controls layer on top of that, traceability work. It doesn't start from the end, it starts from the beginning. And that's a really important point. I have a quote, I think, in my slide deck, which basically says, the best way to start is to start. Right? It doesn't matter what you do, because you will change and you will iterate. So just get started. And so that, you know, a company like BlockApp sort of has the luxury of doing that in the public, of a company like JP Morgan or Microsoft doesn't, right? And so part of the reason why blockchain as a service types of tools are really useful to help are basically to help enterprises understand what they could start with, to suss out the use cases, to figure out the technology, to do test cases and test beds. Those are really important things that are never going to go away, right? Like, what is, how do you deploy every application in your enterprise? You go through massive testing, QA, development internally, go through a beta cycle, et cetera, and long before you ever get it into a public interface, right? And so this is very similar. It's not going to change in the blockchain world just because we have public infrastructure. Parties who don't have the brand risk of large enterprises can be much more free about what they might try to deploy in the public, and we've seen great examples of that in the public, and we've also seen massive failures because of the lack of thoughtfulness, right, around like what someone has enabled with technology. And so, this is a journey. It's very much of a journey, and you make implementation choices, as I said earlier, along the way of like what makes sense for this journey for us, and it's going to change on a yearly basis. The best thing, and I love what Kirti said about this, is success is your best friend, especially in enterprise. And we would not be doing the work we're doing today at Microsoft in the supply chain work if we didn't have success with the work that we've already done. It just opens the door for permission to do the next thing. And so it is just so important to get started on whatever you get started on.